Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Capuana, and today we'll be covering design thinking and user experience here. So let's move forward. If I can. There we go. So my name's Nicole Capuana. For 20 years, I've been designing software and leading teams. I used to work at Lean Dog and built up the design and development studio. Since then, I've gone on and done my own coaching as a product design coach, and I co-founded a startup, both Convey and Launch Vector. I'm an adjunct professor at Case Western Reserve in the EMBA program in their designing organizations class. And I'm also a national speaker on Agile, Lean, and design thinking. So McKinsey did a report, at this point it's probably a year or so ago, and they did a report on design-led companies. And they found that design-led companies had 32% more revenue and 50% higher total returns to shareholders. So design is becoming more and more important, and as this report has shown, like the data is there to show that those who focus in on design and making well-designed products and services are taking the edge and leading. In part of that report, they also did a nice little breakdown here on the value of design. And that's because it comes from having a cross-functional team, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And probably you've sort of gathered from the class so far, cross-functional teams are really important to high-performing modern software development, modern teams, really leading the way. So it is about the user experience. It is about continuous integration and that continual improvement loop and having analytical leadership in place. So before we get going, I ask, what is a designer? Many people think it's those of us who make things look pretty, that we design and we spend lots of time with colors and fussing over types, and some designers do, but not all. So really, anyone who influences what the design becomes is the designer. This includes developers, project managers, corporate, legal. All of us who are in a project together have some influence on what the design of the product and what that design of the service and the experience looks like and feels like, and what the experience really is for those customers who are interacting with it. So I'm going to tell you a little story to help paint the picture of my world that I work in and the things that I have to worry about. So a few years ago, I had a flight to New York City and I was going to a conference, and let's say it was a Friday night that I was leaving, and the conference went over the course of the weekend. So I'm packing up my bags, getting ready to go to the airport, and at 4 o'clock, I get a call from the airline telling me that my flight has been delayed. And so I was pretty surprised that that call came in, and was actually really pleased that it came in. I wasn't expecting that. So I get this call that says my flight's been delayed, and I proceed to get calls every 5 minutes for the next 3 hours telling me that my flight has been delayed. And it has changed, and it changed by, the time moved up a minute, it moved back a minute, it moved it down a gate, up a gate. So I got so many calls that I decided that I would go home and I would spend time with my family having dinner, because it was likely that I was not leaving anytime soon. So in the course of getting these calls every 5 minutes from my new best friend, the digital agent at the airline, I get a call that tells me that my flight is canceled. And so while I'm bummed that I won't be able to make this conference, it is what it is. Well, 5 minutes later, I get another call that tells me that my flight is now, I'm on a new flight, and that flight is leaving in 40 minutes, and I live about 30 minutes from the airport. So I race out of the house, I race to the airport, and I beg and plead the people at the parking lot to just drop me right off at the gate and not pick anybody else up, because I'm running late and I'm really worried about catching this flight. And so I walk into the airport, and there's about 40 kiosks to check in. They are all down. And so I can't go up to any kiosk and print my boarding pass, which I have a boarding pass from earlier, but I'm now on this new flight, so I need a new boarding pass. I see 3 people who are standing by the kiosk who clearly work for the airline, And I go up to them and I ask, hey, can you help me? I need to get a boarding pass. And all three of them say, we're not on the clock. We can't help you. And so now I'm on my phone. I'm trying to log into the website, trying to access my reservation. It can't find me. It can't compute. It's giving me all sorts of errors. My next step is to try to call the airline. And as I walk, with my next plan also being to go to the TSA agents and beg and plead them to let me through with my old boarding pass, I finally see one kiosk that happens to be operational. And I take a chance. I run up to it, print a boarding pass, and then get through the gate, run all the way to the gate, and I managed to get on the plane literally just as they're leaving. And so the point of me telling you that story is that as a customer with that airline, I had interacted with so many different touch points and so many different things for the customer experience of just simply having a flight from here in Cleveland to New York City, right? So I had interacted with the auto caller, I had interacted with the mobile site, I had interacted with the website, I had talked to people, I had interacted with the kiosks. All of those things are part of the ecosystem of flying, right? To be able to travel from point A to point B. And I know I've worked on many systems over time that likely what happened and why it couldn't find me in the system was that the mobile team operated in their own silo from the web team, right? Which operated in a different silo from the back end system. And so when my flight got rebooked, the system couldn't find me, right? And as a customer, that was extremely frustrating and a really bad experience, right? So as I work on building products and building services, I have to consider all of these things that go into what I am providing to the customer. And I want, ideally, to create really great experiences so they keep coming back. And they keep telling their friends or they tell others that this is a really great product or service. So I often tell people when I do my job well, you almost never notice because it's so seamless and easy to use. So this brings us to what is UX? User experience is what it stands for. And some companies have user experience designers on their teams. Some do not. It is definitely growing as far as more and more teams are realizing that it's important to have a user experience designer in the team to help bring the lens of design and the lens of the user to the project. So we'll get into a little bit more details. So while for 20 years I've been designing products and services from a user experience perspective, at the end of the day, I have to balance out all the needs of the users, the needs of the business, and the technical system. Those three things really have to be in balance in order to make sure that we can deliver on the business goals and the business objectives. And there is a way to make them all balanced. No one side is going to win, but if you keep them in balance, you can manage to keep systems from being unnecessarily complicated and still create a great user experience and still drive and deliver those business results. So many people, I alluded to this earlier, think of user experience as just making things look pretty. So I really like this particular visual because it really shows all of the things that go into my world of being a user experience designer. I have to get out there and do field research. I have to talk to people and interview them. I run user tests. I have to be able to synthesize those user tests and pull out insights from them. I have to create UI designs. I have to create interaction designs. I create process flows. I have to worry about the hierarchy of information on a page or a layout or a screen. I have to consider what devices are being used and touch targets. And if it happens to be mobile, I have to think about the words we use so that the words are clear and understandable. I have to think about what happens when things go wrong. You know, if there's an error, how does a user recover from the error? All of that is the world that I spend my time in. And there's a very small part of it that is the interface design, that is the visual design, it is creation of icons and graphics. And while I like to do that, that's really just a small piece of all of the things that I tend to work on. So the key takeaway is user experience is not the same as user interface or UI. To me, user experience is really stepping back to understand the users first and foremost. We want to understand what they're trying to do, what do they need and why, If you go up to people and you ask them what they want, they can't usually tell you what they want. They don't often know what they want. The world didn't know we needed a smartphone, or that we wanted a smartphone, that we wanted our music online or in the cloud, right? If we had been asked those things years ago, we never would have imagined that. But we were maybe frustrated that we were in different places and we didn't have our music with us at all times. And you were like, oh, I'm at a party, I have a really great tune. Wouldn't it be great if I had it? But I don't. It's home on a CD. Or for those of us who are old enough, it might still have been on tape, right? So the key foundation for user experience and part of design thinking, which I'll start to move into in a little bit, is really stepping back and understanding the users, the customers. What do they need? What do they want? Why are they trying to do things? What have they hacked together to make a solution? That often is really insightful for you to figure out how you might actually meet those needs. I used to work on I used to work at Progressive many years ago, and one of the tasks we had to do was to create a system for the call center. So when we would go observe those call center employees and interview them, I always found it really fascinating to see all the little Post-it notes they had pasted around their monitor to give them the reminder or the shortcuts on how to do a particular thing. So all of those were really great things to identify as opportunities to make things better. So stepping back, understand the people. And when we go out and we talk to people, oftentimes I'll start in the beginning of a project where things might be less known. We'll go out and we'll talk to users and we will interview them and ask them really open-ended questions to get them to help tell, their stories, get surface out pains and any frustrations they might have. And after we go out and talk to a group of people, we come back and we create personas. And personas aren't one and done, but they're meant as a starting point to help guide you as you think about the people that you're building for. So in the initial stages, when I come back, we'll create a persona based on those interviews. It's an amalgamation of all of those interviews together where we pull out what are their tasks they're trying to do, what are they feeling, what pain points or what goals were they trying to achieve. And as we continue to learn with ongoing research, we revise those learnings. We may find that as we continue to learn more about the people that we're designing for, we have multiple personas emerge. Some tools that are used to help teams focus this distillation into creating these personas are called empathy. The one thing is called empathy maps. And then there is the jobs to be done model as well. You can look both of those up online, and I believe there are resources linked in the Agile discussion guide on both of those. But those are two frameworks that I use with my teams to help them distill down what we've heard from people and create these personas. And like I said, personas help remind the team about who you're designing for, because at the end of any system we create or any service that we create, there are people who are interacting with what we've created. And back to it's research. It's a lot of research, getting out and talking to people. Many people might not find that overly comfortable to start with, but it's really quite fun. And there's a lot of great things to learn. So going out, talking to people, interviewing them, being able to observe them is even better, because people will say one thing and do another. So when you can actually see them in action, like I said, with the call center example, there was the case where all the Post-it notes were around. That was a good way to observe some behavior. And I have another story where I had another call center that I was working with, where the company wanted to rewrite the system. And before we rewrote that system, we said, well, why not step back and study the people and how they use the current system so that we can understand areas to improve upon instead of just recreating the same thing that may have problems. So I went and I sat with the call center, and this particular call center sent an awful lot of faxes. And I sat with probably 10 different customer service people, and I observed them all go to a screen, type in a phone number, go to the next screen where there were two pre-populated phone numbers, delete those two phone numbers, and go back to the screen where they had put the first number in, copy that number, and come back forward and paste in the number for this fax. And not one of them did this, they all did this. And it was a really interesting thing to observe. So I said, well, why are you doing this? Help me understand why those two numbers that are there, why aren't you using them? And they all essentially said, well, we're sending very sensitive health data, and I want to make sure that the information is going to get to the person I need it to get to. And I confirmed with that person that they're going to be at the number I entered. I didn't have time to even bother to see if those two numbers even matched. I just confirmed it. So that's what I did. So all of them did this, right? They didn't trust that information. And so we removed those two pre-populated fax numbers and automatically pulled forward the number that they entered, which saved each call 30 seconds. And in the grand scheme of things, in the course of a year, it equaled out to $120,000 worth of savings. Now, that might be chump change for some companies, but $120,000 could go towards training that call center, could go help build out more of that system, could hire some more people, right? But had I not sat with those people, I never would have uncovered that opportunity to make things simpler. And they never would have told me, boy, you know, that thing you could fix would be this fax number. So that's really the power of being able to observe people and see what they're doing and being able to ask questions around it. Um, so when you go out and you talk to people, I often recommend that you create a script of things that you'd like to cover and questions that you'd like to ask, so that way you have consistency across your interviews, and make sure that they're open-ended questions so that people respond with really good stories. If you said, you know, do you like coffee or tea? And I say, oh, I like coffee, right? But if you ask me, can you tell me about the last time you made a cup of tea? Well, telling you is going to get into more elaborate, like, oh, well, I got the electric kettle out and I put it on the counter, and then I had to decide which tea did I want. And then I chose my favorite mug because it was cold this afternoon and I wanted to just be comforted by both my favorite mug and a nice cup of tea, right? That is much more rich in detail than simply, do you like coffee or tea? So in the beginning, like I said, there's user interviews, there's observations. Those should continue on and on as you go. But as you start to build some prototypes and some concepts together, or even if you have an existing product, this is certainly very eye-opening, is to go run user tests with people and have them try to use your product. And that is always humbling. No matter how far along you are in the project, there's always things to be learned, that something might not be clear, they don't know that they should scroll. I've seen it all. It's always a great way to get some feedback on both the usability and how people are reacting to what you're creating. The other elements to get to help round out your research and to help you make a data-informed decision, right, is go get any analytics you have. Um, Find out what you have, gather it. Some companies may have trouble tracking that down, but start with what you got and keep adding to it. And so you're going to balance out this both quantitative and qualitative data. And together, those will help you make really great design decisions that are data informed. And then as you learn these things, share these with the team, because the more the team is involved, the more empathetic they are for the people we're creating for, and they feel involved in the process. So I mentioned earlier that people do one thing and say another, and just to reinforce the power of this, there was a study done a few years ago where researchers stood outside of a public restroom, I believe it was in London, and they asked people as they were coming out of that restroom, did you wash your hands? And all of them said, of course, yes, I washed my hands. Yes, I washed my hands. Well, they didn't realize that the researchers had put video cameras above the sinks and actually recorded what people did. So in that study, they found that 99% said they washed their hands, but in actuality, 32% of men did and 64% of women did. Now, if I was in the class with you today in person, I know you would all go, ew, like, I can't believe that. But it's a really powerful example of people will do one thing and say another. In general, people like to please, so of course they'll want to say what they think you want to hear. And that's where the power of being able to observe what they do gives you even greater insight. So User experience, like I mentioned, not all companies have them, but if you do have user experience, this is one of the key things I have learned in the last 8 years, is that user experience is essential to being part of the team. They're not some sort of service you call at the last minute. They're not somebody you say, hey, I need you for a week, and then you can go. User experience is really the whole team's responsibility, but that user experience designer needs to be part of that team. There are no silos. You make their work just as visible as the developers. It's really key that UX is part of the team. Now, in some projects and some organizations, user experience designers may be able to support more than one project, but certainly no more than two, and it depends on how complicated those projects are. Really complicated projects actually require you to have more than just one user experience designer. That's where you might get into some specialization and have someone who focuses just on user research, and then someone who focuses more on the interaction design. It's hard and rare to find someone who does it all, but in the framework of a T-shaped person, you want people who are deep in one specialty and have the ability to broaden out that T into those other spheres. So for me, when I first started, I did not have much depth in the research area, but over time, I've gained that breadth and depth because I've broadened out my T. So when there are user experience people on the team, many teams end up trying this dual track development, which I'm not a huge fan of, but this is the reality for many companies to get started as they then start to mature. But in this model, user experience tries to work at least a sprint ahead of the developers. So I prefer to work in 1 week sprints, but some companies do 2 week sprints. And Lord, I've heard of others go longer, but really it's just the UX design is trying to stay one step ahead of development so they can do that research, they can do the testing, do the design, and then that informs the building that the developers then take card and say, okay, now we're going to build this thing. What I don't like about this is it still feels a bit like waterfall, where as the designer, I'm running ahead and then I'm sending it back and sort of throwing it down the line so I can work on the next thing. Um, and over time, that starts to feel, from a designer's perspective, like I'm often feeding an insatiable beast, because the developers are like, we need more work, we need more work. And I'm like, running. And if you're only one person on the team who's doing that design element, that's a lot of load to try to race ahead and not have time to maybe do due diligence on areas that are coming out of research as being not well baked or needing more work, right? Design is hard, and getting to simple is hard. It's like the first design I make is never the right thing, but I need to get it out there, learn from it, and iterate and refine. Not to say that it needs to be perfect, but to get it to a point where it feels good enough that we feel comfortable at starting to create this good experience that we can start to build it. So I share this though, because all teams end up asking about how user experience fits in on the team. One, they're part of the team. Two, how you visualize the work is you end up having these two work streams: design, then that feeding into the coding and the development side, and then design running ahead. So like I said, I'm not a huge fan of this, but this is often where companies start. What I am more of a fan of is the single track approach. And that is where I have found more mature teams, or teams that are maybe brand new to this and are eager to just jump fully embracing into the agile and lean concepts, is to have a small cross-functional team. And that team is always focused on value and focusing on that value together. So if the thing of value is that we need to figure out what our customers need, then the whole team needs to be swarming around that discovery and understanding of the customer. And then likewise, once we know what we're going to build, then the team can shift to swarming on building that, right? So as a designer, when it gets to the build time, there's still plenty of things that we need to do. We need to create the styles. We might need to create assets, visual assets like icons and buttons. If if the designer knows a little bit of code like I do, which can sort of be dangerous, I can pair with a developer and we can actually be pairing on that code creation. So the single track is all one stream of work. Everybody's focusing on value. You're swarming sort of between these modalities of we need to discover, or now we know what we're going to build, so let's start to execute. And then in recent times, we've had with Google Ventures, this is now probably a couple of years old for sure, they introduced the idea of design sprints, which is really taking that cross-functional team and saying, what can we do in a week, right? We have an idea, that's day one. Let's structure our discussions. On day two, let's ideate around what that might be. And let's build something up of small prototypes so that we can test it with people on Friday. And I have to pause for a second because one of my coworkers these days wants to go outside the door. That dog will be back in about 2 minutes, so I'll have to go open the door again. I apologize, but it's the new normal. So design sprints have been really effective for teams in the early stages of projects or when teams get stuck. So I find that in the beginning where it's like, let's envision like what might we could do, doing the design sprints really focuses the team on doing something small and iterative so that we can learn. And then likewise, as you move along in a product or service development, you may find there's moments where you're like, we're not sure how to solve this thing. So taking a step back and explicitly carving out a week to say, let's run a design sprint, let's experiment, that usually helps get the team unstuck and surface out some new ideas. So that's the user experience portion, which bleeds a bit into design thinking. And I would pause here and ask if you have any questions for the concept of user experience. There's a lot I sort of threw at you. And personally, as I create this deck, and I've done this class many a times with John, is that I personally, there's user experience and then there's design thinking, and they do feel very, very related. So I think some of the stuff that I'll talk a bit about in the design thinking chapter is applicable to the user experience design, which is why they're both bundled here together. So we'll move forward into what is design thinking. If you have questions about the user experience portion, just feel free to add them to the Q&A in the session, and we'll get to them at the end. So I'll move forward here. And like I said, we'll fully expect my dog will be back here in about 2 seconds. So what is design thinking? Design thinking is an iterative approach to solving fuzzy problems. And this is why I feel it's a lot like what my world is as a user experience designer is. I feel I've been doing design thinking for 20 years here, right? We're about trying to step out and form some empathy and understand the people we're creating for. We need to challenge assumptions. We need to find different ways to, look at things in different ways. We often reframe the problem because the original problem maybe is not the main problem as we learn, as we talk to people. And then we'll find some solutions that might not be overly obvious. And I'll share some stories about that in a minute. So I mentioned that I teach at CASE in the EMBA program, and this is something that I use with all of my students. So in that particular class, I meet one-on-one with students who are working professionals, and they have a project that they bring forward to work on for the course of the year and using design thinking. And so I have found this is particularly helpful to share with them in the beginning because oftentimes many of us live in this day-to-day management side of things, right? Where things are more known, there's clear objectives, we're trying to make the existing stuff better, and it's naturally feels a bit more constrained. And so that might be micro adjustments that we make to make things better optimize and improve, right? So most of us, like I said, in most companies spend their time in this day-to-day management side of things. But when you're in and applying design thinking and leading a design change, that's where you have to step back and recognize that things are fuzzy. It's not going to feel nice and neat and clean. And it often feels like you might be fumbling around in the dark. You absolutely need a cross-functional team of people to bring to the table, to bring different perspectives, to try to figure out this problem, figure out where we might be going, to find a new way of doing things. Your outcomes aren't predictable. The solutions aren't clearly obvious. And you need to step back and say, you know what, there's no constraints. Let's just see what we can learn and then hone in on. So I find this little chart, like I said, helpful to just give you some framework that most of us, like I said, end up on the day-to-day side, but the leading the design side is a really fun and messy and uncomfortable space to be. But personally, it's a space I love to be in. And this is a good representation of what it feels like when you start doing design thinking. So in the beginning, it feels like this giant tangled knot, and you're just trying to find a little thread, and you feel like you're running in circles and you're in the dark, right? Because there's a lot of uncertainty, and you're trying to figure out what that problem really is. How might you solve it, right? What can we learn about people? And the more we learn and the more we make our iterations through this sort of process, things will start to become clearer. We'll gain more focus. But this is not a straight point. It's not from A to B. It's all over the place. And that cycle or that circle will get more refined as you go. But day one, you're going to be at the very beginning of this squiggle. And depending on the types of projects or the problems you're solving, it could be maybe years before you sort of get that clarity and focus. And I think it's maybe interesting times right now with COVID-19 sending us home, um, and sort of stressing out the healthcare systems. I think we're starting to see a lot of innovation happening within the healthcare system itself, where people are trying to solve these things because it's a crisis, and it feels like maybe even more chaotic because of crisis mode, but also like, how do we design? How can we solve this thing? I had one student who is a physician, and he is a pulmonologist. Hold on a second. And one of the things he is working on as a pulmonologist and worried about with the amount of patients coming in and needing ventilators and not having enough of ventilators is, he had an idea like, could I take a valve from Home Depot, and could I create a valve system that would allow me to hook up a ventilator to multiple patients? Right. So he's in the prototyping stage of this, and rapidly doing this because of crisis mode. But like I said, that really came to light for him because he had just gone through this design thinking class, but also saying, like, stepping back and looking at the problem in a different way. So know that it's okay to feel totally uncomfortable in the beginning, because it's going to feel like that. And over time, trust me, it will get better. So if I haven't said this enough, it's really about understanding the people and understanding the needs of those people that we create for, and having empathy for them. So, having empathy that the call center people were spending all this time deleting those too darn numbers and coming back as a screen was allowed us to make a very simple case to say, if we remove these fax numbers, we can make things better. We can make their lives better. So step back. First step, understand the people. So this is it looks like a very nice little chart here and a nice little line, but trust me, it's that big tangly knot that I just showed you in the squiggle. When you start doing that design thinking process, first step is let's empathize. We have to understand the people. That helps us define the problem. As we learn what their pain points are, we can start to define that problem. We can start to ideate on how we might solve that problem. We sometimes ideate and learn, we got to go back to empathy. We might have to go back to definition. But if I move forward, I'll start to prototype some ideas, and learning from and testing those prototypes will help me learn that I'm on the right path or I'm on the wrong path, right? Which might send me back to empathy, or might send me back to definition, or back to ideation. So while this chart looks nice and neat, it's really not. But these are the main steps that you walk through. So empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping, and testing, and just one constant circle. So I've mentioned this earlier. For empathy, get out of the building. Most likely your customers are not in the building. Most likely the people who work in the building are not the people who know the answers. You got to get out there and talk to your customers. Now, if you're creating something for maybe your employees, then yes, your customers are in the building, and there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't get out there and talk to them. Some particular industries, it might be really complicated to try to get a hold of customers. And in that case, if you have difficulty reaching customers, I suggest working through your sales channel, working through customer service. Those are 2 points where you should be able to get a hold of some people. And if you truly are looking for a very highly specialized customer, that you can leverage recruiting services to try to find people. So if you were looking for neurologists who live in Tennessee, who drive red Porsches on Saturdays, and know how to play chess, then you could leverage a recruiting service to find those people. Now, the more specific you are in that particular extreme case, you probably have to pay a bit more to have those recruited. So regardless, get out of the building, talk to your customers, listen to what they're saying. Don't try to sell your idea, just listen and hear what they're saying. Ask what they're, hear what they're saying and what they're not saying. What's their body language like? As you listen, you'll inevitably have additional questions you want to probe, and say like, hey, tell me more about that. Why was that? Why are you deleting those 2 fax numbers? Oh, you don't trust the numbers. Okay. So listen, observe, take notes, because I tell you, you'll never remember everything. If you can record it, even better, because then you could have a transcription of it, but take notes. And I often suggest, back to the power of pairs, is if you're going to go off and you talk to customers, go as a pair. One person can be doing the interviewing and talking and listening, and the other person can be taking notes. And then as you come back, you have to reflect, what did you learn, right? How does that help shape your understanding of the customer and their needs? So as we move into ideation, we step into the mindset of like, well, how might we solve that? No idea is a bad idea. I've done these ideation sessions with cross-functional teams, and it's really amazing to see some of the ideas come from the least likely or least expected person at the table. I've had really quiet engineers be in the room and all of a sudden have this insane, wonderful, brilliant idea on how to solve, an interaction in the interface, or creating a chat or something that just was unexpected. So really, in the ideation space and sessions that you run, tell everyone, no idea is a bad idea, right? Get all the ideas out. We can always shoot down ideas. We can also build on ideas, and that iteration around that ideation helps build up the best of those ideas. 2 methods to do some ideation, at least from a software development side of things, is Design Studio method and Crazy Eights. And both of them really are pretty much very similar, where individuals sketch out ideas and then you share those ideas. And in the Design Studio method, you actually pitch for 2 minutes and pitch your idea, and then be critiqued for 3 minutes. And so Design Studio method is very time bound, where it's like 5 minutes of sketching, 2 minutes of pitch, 3 minutes of critique, and then you build on those ideas based on the critiques that you get. Crazy Eights, though, it's like taking a piece of paper, which thankfully I have one next to me, and I did not fold it ahead of time, so bear with me, but this is our whole new normal. So I like blank paper because I hate lines, but you take a piece of paper and fold it in half, then fold it in half again, and then fold it in half again. Doesn't have to be perfect. But then you've got a page with 8 panes. And if you sort of sketch out your ideas and try to express your idea in each of the panes, that's what a Crazy Eight is. And again, individually people sketch, And then you share the ideas and you talk through your ideas. And then you could go into a dot voting activity where the team could sort of dot vote the ideas that seem the most interesting, or they want to build on some more, or they really like. So that is Crazy Eights. And oftentimes when I get into design, when I tell teams, hey, we're going to do this sort of ideation, if they haven't gone through it before, people get really uncomfortable and they say, oh, I can't draw. But I tell people, if you can draw I don't know if you can see that, a square, a triangle, a circle, a dot, and a line, you can pretty much communicate any idea you have. So it doesn't have to be a Van Gogh or perfect or Picasso or whatever. It just needs to be able to quickly communicate your idea. So I guess most of us should be able to have been able to do those shapes probably since we were very, very little. So no excuse to not draw. So ideation is, like I said, the second step in the design thinking process. And then we move into prototyping. And for software teams, you want to prototype as quickly as you can because it's a way to launch your ideas. And oftentimes it's like, how can you learn something without actually coding? Because code's really expensive. So can you create a prototype that's paper? Can you create a prototype that's maybe a clickable prototype? Is there some way you can simulate it without actually writing a line of code? The further you get in that sort of design squiggle or the cone of uncertainty, which I believe you've covered in another chapter, because things are more clear, you may then, of course, start to work in code, and you'll have some things that you're building up that you can then share. So we use prototyping, though, to validate directions and reveal opportunities quickly and cheaply. Like I said, like, how do we do it as cheap as possible? In this particular example, or these two examples shown here, were two projects that I worked on. And one, we ended up creating a giant paper prototype with those flip charts. And we made everything highly modular because we were unsure as to where the best placement of that information was. And that allowed us to put it in front of users and ask questions and be able to sort of adapt on the fly. So investing in building out maybe a little more complicated of a paper prototype early on actually paid great dividends as we were able to sort of suss out that information as well. And then the top image there is a little mini robot, and I was working on a household robot project a few years ago, and the team that was working on the big robot was taking forever. And so as we were writing code to control this robot, we were unable to show our client and our customer that the code was working. And so the developer I was working with at the time decided over the course of the weekend to 3D print a tiny mini robot using the same Arduino board that the big robot was going to have on it, so that come that Monday in our show and tell with our client, we were able to demonstrate that, you know what, the code to manually drive that robot works because we could show using a mobile app that we could connect up to the cloud and communicate down to that little robot and drive it around. So that's the power of prototyping. Not only were we able to test with users with it, but we also could demonstrate that things were sort of working, right, in a very cheap way. So like I said, typically start with paper, start to increase your fidelity over time. These days, especially as we're now remote, there are a gazillion tools that are out there that help you do some software prototyping. And Cooper has done a really nice review of those tools. Some have steeper learning curves than others. Some are very simple and like just clickable, hotspotty type of prototypes. But like one tool I used a few years ago allowed actually being able to test across different mobile devices, like having one mobile device talk to another mobile device. And so that was really important for the project that I was working on at the time. However, it had a steeper learning curve. So I probably wrangled with it for about a week to try to figure it out. But in the end, I was actually able to mimic sort of this, what we would have eventually coded. And if you're not creating a software, you can certainly do things on a concierge side of things, right? Where you maybe try to deliver the service in a concierge model where people could, say, I want to get groceries, and they give you a list, and then you're the one who goes and does that. Right? You didn't need to build out Instacart just yet. You could have maybe started with a few people who were sort of these shoppers. And the reason why we prototype is, like I mentioned earlier, I'm never right the first time. We've got to learn whether we're on the right path or we're on the wrong path, or like how do we course correct. And the more you can do that iteration and have those short feedback loops, the better you can course correct without it being a long period of time. Because if you can fix things in the design stage, the cost of fixing things is very small. And that's what the 10x, 100x, and 1000x is. Fixing it in design is 10x. Fixing it once it gets to code is 10x. It gets a lot more complicated to start to change the code. And then heaven forbid it launches to production, that cost to fix things is 1,000 times the cost. So test early and often is to try to avoid that 1000x. So here again, it's just from a software perspective, a fidelity of prototypes. You can see on the left is very sketchy, and then the fidelity increases over time. But in the early days, I didn't need to test with the full-on UI on the right. That would be too much. That would be wasteful of my time if I had learned early on that that was not the right structure for the app. So I alluded to this earlier. Really, the prototyping process and all of this is these fast feedback loops. You want to build, measure, learn. You may have heard that from Lean Startup, right? I often like to think of learn, build, and then measure, right? But wherever you are on that cycle, it's about going around and around and through that cycle to refine, review, and reframe the problem. So I mentioned I had a story earlier about reframing of the problem through design thinking. And that was one of my students, again, at Case, wanted to improve the check-in experience at their facility. And the student thought, oh, I just need to add more people with tablets and the problem will be solved. And so as she went through the course of her project and her observation and her interviews and gathering of the data, she really came to understand that actually it wasn't increasing utilization through technology that was a problem. It was actually a space design problem. So in her facility, there were kiosks where people would come in and go in and check into those kiosks. And what she discovered was that all these kiosks were shoved to the sides, sort of in the shadows of the walls. And looking to analogous industries, she looked at airlines and airports and realized, well, wait a minute, if I just move these kiosks and sort of design the space with that design lens, I can make the kiosk front and center and make it crystal clear. This is your first stop. Stop here and check in at the kiosk. So when she went through that process, like that to me is a great example of stepping back. She realized the problem was something different. It was a space design issue. It wasn't a technology issue. Sure, she could add more technology, but at the end of the day, that necessarily wouldn't have solved it. So just another story to sort of paint that picture. And we have a great video. It is 6 minutes, so I will play it here. And this was done a few years ago and was really probably quite radical at the time. And Nordstrom, who is quite innovative as a company, had created an innovation lab. And they took a small cross-functional team and they created a sunglass iPad app in the course of a week. And where did they do it? They did it at the flagship store in the sunglass section. So I'm going to hit play.